Hi guys, so this is the very first, well, I guess technically second if you count the introduction video, but the very first video in my series, Linux from Zero to Hero, switching to Linux. So this is part of the basic tutorial or the complete series and is going to give you some tips and tricks and explanations on what to expect from Linux. So let's talk about Linux. What exactly is Linux? Well, first, Linux is not an operating system. It is a kernel. Many operating systems are based on Linux and use Linux, but they are not themselves Linux. Android is not Linux. It uses the Linux kernel. So that's the first big point about Linux. Linux is a core component of an operating system, much in the way Windows has System 32 or Kernel 32, which is the kernel in Windows. Linux-based distributions have Linux. Linux is a core component of any Linux-based operating system or Linux distribution, as they tend to be called. And of course, Linux is awesome because it's awesome. We'll get into why later. But let's move on and talk about distributions, specifically the distribution that this particular series and most of the videos on my channel tend to target. Let's talk about Debian. What is Debian? Debian is a Linux-based operating system or distribution that uses a variety of different components from various upstream developers. Linux, you'll find out, is extremely modular, and it tends to contain tons of different components from all over the spectrum, and they can be freely taken out and used however you want. If you don't like your taskbar, install a new one. If you don't like your desktop environment, install a new one. That's kind of the philosophy of Linux. If something's not working well, use another component. And that's sort of the beauty of the Linux operating system, Linux-based operating systems, is they are modular like that, especially very big ones like Debian that have several different packages. Debian includes tools and components from the GNU project, as well as projects like GNOME, KDE, XFace, or XFCD, LXDE, and many others. Actually, many others. Debian includes thousands of software packages that several thousand developers have around the world packaged and maintained for Debian. Debian is made up of free and open source software. Debian is 100% free, as in freedom, and it's also gratis. So there's that. Debian does provide infrastructure for the distribution of non-free software for users who choose to use proprietary wireless and graphics drivers. So if you have some hardware that is not compatible with all free and open source drivers, you can absolutely install proprietary components direct from their various manufacturers. That is not forbidden in Debian. However, it is not necessarily necessary to do that depending on what you're trying to do with your system. If you want to do video games, you might want to consider the proprietary NVIDIA driver. If you're just looking at the web or, doing PowerPoint presentations such as these, then maybe the open source driver is good. Kind of up to you. You feel it out with what you want to do, right? So the next bit is, what is free software? Free software is software that can be freely redistributed. It includes the source code and can be distributed as source code or in binary form, and allows for derived works. It doesn't discriminate against persons, groups, or fields of endeavor. So you can't say like, you can't use this software for genetic research or such and such thing. The license applies to all whom the program is redistributed, which means basically there's no need for a new license to be applied to certain groups or whatever. And free software is software that is free as in freedom and is not necessarily free as in gratis, although most free software is gratis. So basically, not all free software is just free. Some free software you do have to pay for. For instance, RHEL uses a lot of free and open source products, but you have to buy RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Debian, as I stated before, is 100% free, both as in freedom and it's gratis. You don't ever have to pay anyone any money to use Debian. Most of the points from this slide, basically all except for the last one, are derived from the Debian Free Software Guidelines. We'll discuss that in the next video, why Debian. So what is open source software? Open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. Open source software is not necessarily free software, but free software is always open source, because the source code has to be distributed with the software in order for it to be considered free software. Open source software is great because it allows anyone to audit the code. This allows us, users, developers, whoever, to easily determine if a product has code or features that are not in a user's best interest. If you want to find out if a particular company, like for instance Microsoft, has put some evil malicious code in their software in order to spy on their users, it's a little bit more difficult to find something like that out. And I'm not saying Microsoft has even done something like that, but if they had, how would you know? You can't see the source code. You can't audit what they're doing. Not easily. So, free and open source software is easily auditable by anyone. Anyone can look at that code. And just because you can't read source code or make heads or tails of it, well, a lot of other people out there can. And that increases the vetting of that code, because more and more eyes can look at it. And anyone, like you for instance, could learn how to read programming languages and understand and interpret what they are doing, and can therefore audit and vet that code yourself if you so chose to do that thing. This makes it much more difficult for malicious or bad actors to insert things into the code that could cause users harm. Now, I'm not suggesting that that never happens, but when it does happen, it's a lot easier to spot because we can actually look at the code and tell what's going on. Another thing that you should remember with open source software is that you should always strive to run the latest security patches on open source and free software. Anyone can audit the code, including evildoers, which means that the fact that anyone can audit the code is kind of a double-edged sword, because yes, good people who want to fix problems and develop patches and create solutions can easily access the code to fix problems. However, so can a hacker who wants to do you harm. So you need to make sure that you keep your software up to date as frequently as possible, because any exploitation of the free and open source code means that anyone can see it. Anyone can see that's a problem. So it's important to keep your stuff up to date if you're using open source code. I mean, it's important to keep yourself up to date if you're using anything ever. So it's not really like this is a knock on Linux or a knock on open source. But with open source, I feel like it's particularly important to stay on top of your game with patching and updates. The good news is that with Linux, patching and updates are kind of a breeze. We'll cover that topic in a later video. Who should consider switching to Linux? Well, the brief answer is anyone who wants to. If you're interested in Linux, you kind of owe it to yourself to try Linux. I think that you're doing yourself a big disservice by not at least attempting to try it. I guess the next bit would be novice users who don't do much with their systems. So there's this idea that Linux is just for geeks, and that only nerdy people who have giant brains can figure out the intricacies of Linux. But that's not really so. I mean, it's just like with Windows. If you use Windows as a power user, or whatever that means, then, you know, you do advanced tasks with your system. essentially, right? And if you do advanced tasks with your system, then your expectations for your system are going to be a lot tighter. You're going to want it to do things very specifically and in very specific ways. And when that kind of user tries to switch with Linux over to Linux, they might encounter some barriers and walls that a novice user who's just using their computer to browse the web and edit text documents might not so much encounter, right? If you just want to browse the web, edit some text, maybe make a picture or something, do simple things with your computer, you're fine. Linux, you're a shoo-in for Linux because those tasks are easily reproducible on a Linux system. It's only those who have very, very, very high expectations, almost unrealistic expectations, people who are almost looking for flaws, those are the people who are going to have issues when they try to switch to Linux. Self-proclaimed power users might have issues switching to Linux because they expect their systems to do things in specific ways that Linux may or may not be able to particularly accommodate. That's not to say that Linux isn't powerful and can't handle tasks that Windows can handle. It can. You just have to be willing to learn a new way of doing things. So the next are people who are already familiar with open source software. If you're already using software like the GIMP, LibreOffice, Blender, Inkscape, any other open source project out there, if you're already using these kinds of software on Windows, that software is also available on Linux. If you are heavily, heavily, heavily reliant on Microsoft Office for whatever reason, then switching to Linux might be more difficult for you. Although I'd like to point out that Office 365 should work on Linux just fine. There's really no reason why not. It's a web browser thing. And Google Docs also works well on Linux. So realistically speaking, that group of people who are already familiar with open source software, that's kind of getting bigger and bigger every day. So any of those people, feel free to switch. You won't be disappointed. People who are open to doing things differently or learning new skills. If you're cool with change, doing things differently, if you're not set in your ways or stuck in a particular workflow, then you are a prime candidate. Start migrating today. And people who know how to manage their expectations, because that's what Linux is all about, really. That is managing your expectations. People who, again, try to switch over and expect their Linux system to look and feel and behave exactly like Windows did, not really going to have a pleasant experience. And that brings me to my next topic, things to remember before switching. And number one is, Linux is not Windows. And for most distributions, it's not trying to be. And that's a very good thing. Linux is great because it's different. If Linux was constantly trying to be on the coattails of Windows, it would never be better than Windows. It could never be anything but subservient to Windows. Because Linux does things in a different, new, and exploratory and profound way, that makes it, I don't want to say better, but it gives it an edge in places that Windows lacks. It gives it the ability to be versatile and modular, and it gives users the ability to customize their systems in ways that they just can't really scratch the surface of on Windows. In operating systems like Windows or even Mac OS, there are specific parts of the operating system that are designed from the ground up so that you can't really mess with them. You're not supposed to touch certain things in Windows. Not really. And that is not the case with Linux. With Linux, you have the entire source code for the whole operating system. You could recompile the whole thing from scratch if you really wanted to. You can do whatever you want. Really, the sky is the limit, and you are honestly, in Linux, limited only by your own skill set and your willingness to learn. Because if you want to do it in Linux, you can find a way. If you're stubborn enough and willing to push through a problem, you can solve it. And that's the beauty of Linux. Linux is a paradigm shift, and you will need to learn some new things before being able to use it for more than just web browsing. Again, if all you want to do is browse the web, then Linux is fine. But if you want to really get in there and manage users and manage your file system and mess with permissions and install really cool pieces of software and really use your system like an admin or a quote-unquote power user would, you're going to need to be open to learning some things. Might even want to brush with the command prompt, if you're really edgy. It's just something to keep in mind. Linux is a paradigm shift. You're not going to be in Windows when you use Linux. Linux is not going to behave the same way Windows did. And that is a good thing. Linux is not a direct replacement for Windows. Although it can do and perform similar tasks to Windows, and in many cases it does replace Windows completely, that's not really the goal. The goal is to make a usable, amazing operating system that tons of people can get them, use and do and grow on and build. It is an operating system, a group of operating systems really, that is by the users and for the users. And one of the really cool things about Linux is that because a lot of these operating systems, such as Debian for instance, are not really corporate entities. Some are, like Ubuntu and Red Hat. They're corporate entities. Debian is not. Debian is an organization, and because it is an organization with a group of people who are just trying to make the best operating system they possibly can, they can do things sometimes that might not necessarily be possible on a for-profit operating system. A for-profit operating system might forego a feature that they don't think is going to get them any money or isn't going to go over well with lots of users. Debian, on the other hand, can support those niche users who would like a certain feature because they don't care. They're not charging for the operating system. They can do whatever they want. And that's what's fantastic about Debian, is you see really, really cool and interesting projects in the operating system that you probably wouldn't see in other places. Another big thing to keep in mind, if you think that Wine is going to help your Linux distribution be a substitute for Windows, think again. Wine is a fantastic piece of software, and Wine alternatives such as Play on Linux's Proton, or not Play on Linux, I'm sorry, Steam Play's Proton port or fork of Wine, these are fantastic projects. They do a lot of really fantastic work. The developers there are doing amazing things. Being able to make software believe it's running on a completely different operating system with a compatibility layer is incredible. And the fact that they've managed to get things to work as well as they have is absolutely unbelievable. I can play Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, for instance, on 4K at max settings with a 970 NVIDIA video card, and it's fine. And that's a game that was never intended to run on Linux. And all I had to do was press play on Steam. And that's fantastic. However, you cannot rely on that. You have to understand that your mileage may vary with Wine, and that not all Windows software is going to work well, if at all. Some may not even launch. Some might launch and crash. Others might run perfectly. It's really hit or miss. You need to do your research, and definitely don't rely on it. Another thing to realize is in Linux there are tons of different distributions and desktop environments. If one distribution or environment frustrates you, try another. Linux is extremely diverse and extremely modular. If you don't like GNOME, switch to KDE. If those two feel too heavy for you, try XFCE or LXDE, or Cinnamon, or LXQT, or Budgie, or any of the other ones out there. There's literally hundreds. And that's the beauty of Linux. And then the last 3 points are extremely important to remember when you're searching for help regarding Linux. Linux forums and help groups, people who support Linux, are often volunteers. In fact, 99% of the time they're volunteers. They are not equivalent to Microsoft paid support. They are helping you because they enjoy helping people and because they are awesome. They are not obligated to fix your problems, so be polite. Right? A lot of people go into these Linux forums with unrealistic expectations, and they get belligerent when their problem isn't solved immediately, and they feel like they can treat these people like they're paid support technicians in a call center or something, but they're not. They're nerds that hang out on the internet and help people out of the kindness of their hearts in most cases. So really, the code of conduct here is try to do your research, right? Go to Google, DuckDuckGo, even Bing if you have to, whatever your pleasure. I don't really care. Go to a search engine, type your problem in there, see if it's been solved before. Check around on the internet. Try some things out. Try to do your research. Do your due diligence. Then, and only then, start making a list of all the things that you've done to troubleshoot your problem and give an accurate and complete error message, sometimes providing logs, especially if the user or if the person helping you asks for additional information, and try to supply as much of that as you can, barring security information. So, maybe black out the IP addresses or change them around or something if you need. I'm not telling you to give another person on the internet your entire identity, but give them enough information to help you with your problem. Okay? A lot of people like to go online and say, I have this problem, offer no information about it, and then expect the other person to try to figure out what the heck is going on. They can't see your computer. They can't see your error messages. You need to be precise with what's really going on. So, try to provide accurate and complete reports about what's really going on with your system, and try to list the solutions and things that you've tried in order to solve the problem. Remember that people who support Linux are there to guide you, not to do the work for you. Unless you're paying for support from a place like RHEL or one of those other companies that actually charge for it, you don't really have the right to be belligerent or demanding of anybody who's trying to help you. And the last bullet point, in case you don't get it, be polite. Seriously, it goes a really incredibly long way. I can't count how many good experiences that I have had on the internet, on IRC, on forum boards and chats, just talking to Linux users and Linux professionals who are just trying to help people. And my experience is so much better because I'm not demanding, and I'm polite and courteous and respectful of their time and expertise. And to me, that's critical. If you can't do those things, you're not going to have a good experience on Linux. Because again, Linux isn't Windows, and it's not trying to be. And that's a very good thing. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something from it. The next video will be why Debian, and it will talk more about specifics of Debian, what makes Debian great, some interesting things I found out about Debian through the years. It'll just be kind of a cool informational sort of video like this one, probably with a slideshow and maybe some views of the Debian website, etc. and so forth. And then after that video, we'll get into some real demonstrations. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or whatever, please comment below. I do read them. And hopefully I'll be able to continue doing that, depending on how gnarly they get, I guess. We'll see. Thanks again.